Ho, ho, ho! It's another Daily Tea Christmas special. And today we're coming to you right from the heart of Westminster to look back at a seismic year in politics and what it's been like to cover it for The Telegraph.
We've seen the collapse of the Conservative Party, the start of a Labour government so bad that surely things can only get better, and the rise of Reform and the Liberal Democrats.
Plus, we're going to pull back the curtain on lobby journalism. What is it like to ride a battle bus in an election campaign, or to watch PMQs from the gin-addled press gallery? Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Tim Stanley.
And me, Dominic Penna.
Dom, can I start by asking, where on earth are we? I barely recognise this room. We've come up several flights of stairs to get into this Rapunzel's tower. And for those who can't see it, there are oak-panelled walls, a lovely view through the window of the Thames, but otherwise the colour is green. There is pea green carpets, dark green curtains, and we are wearing Commons green.
Our parliamentary Christmas jumpers.
We are chameleons fitting in. What is this room?
So this is the old lobby room, and until a few years ago, this is where lobby briefings would take place. Lobby briefings take place usually twice a day, once on Fridays, and the so-called lobby of political journalists, which include us, they will basically grill the Prime Minister of the day's spokesman with various important and often less important questions. And those briefings were moved just before the pandemic, actually, to 9 Downing Street. And if you cast your mind back to those dark days of COVID and the daily press conferences, there was a very blue room in 9 Downing Street. And that is where the lobby briefings now take place. But before that, they were here in this significantly harder to get to room.
And easy to get lost on the way too. Why do we call it the lobby? What is the lobby? Because I associate that word with hotels.
So the lobby, as well as obviously every hotel does have a lobby, but it is also the collective noun for a flock of political journalists.
Right.
And it is called the lobby because of our parliamentary passes giving us access to the central lobby, which whenever there's just been a big vote in Parliament, you will probably be familiar with broadcasters grabbing MPs and seeing how many of them will talk, and sort of a steady stream of people rushing about in the background while the broadcasters do their thing. That is central lobby. And
a lot of MPs hanging around there also.
Oh yes, desperate to be seen.
Yes, they just happen to bump into us.
Hassling the journalists
like
more than we hassle them.
Night, we happen to be passing, and next thing we know, we've got half an hour with Mark Francois. What about the journalists, though? Where physically would you find the journalists in Parliament?
So you would find us on the 3rd floor of the press gallery in a corridor called Burma Road, where every single lobby team has its own office. Every newspaper has a lobby team. Every lobby team has its own office. And it's called Burma Road after a very dark and treacherous network of tunnels that we used during the Second World War. So a bit of classic political journalism, gallows humour there.
And it's also overrun with mice.
Oh yes, and yeah, semi-regular power cuts, the works.
Right. Okay.
That is where we all are.
And what is your day job like? You're a lobby journalist, so how do you spend your time?
So as a political correspondent, I do the Telegraph's politics newsletter, which takes a couple of hours of each day. And that is basically a digest and an analysis of the big things that are happening that day. The rest of the time, it's, for example, on diary events. So, for example, Prime Minister's questions, all the different select committees, all the things that are happening that, regardless of whether it's exclusive or not, everyone has to cover, basically. So, for example, when Keir Starmer or Kemi gives a speech. But then the rest of my time is spent chasing stories, keeping in touch with contacts, trying to get exclusives. A fair amount of that is dining contacts and that side of things.
Right. And what is the dining like here?
Oh, it's brilliant. There's lots of different catering options. I should say that they are all a bit subsidised.
They are very
subsidised. Which has been the
subsidised,
source of much frustration.
Yeah.
But I'd say that my go-to here would be the Lord's Canteen.
The
River Restaurant.
I agree. I think the main meals are best in the Lord's Canteen, but the dessert is better in the Commons Canteen.
Yes,
because
agreed.
the custard is thicker. It's the Lords, they water it down too much. This is one of my favourite bits about working in Parliament is the food. It's school food. It's all meat and 2 veg plus a suet pudding. And I think it's absolutely delicious. And I have seen MPs who come regularly, and they'll bring their wife and an assistant. And I'm convinced they run for Parliament just to keep access to the subsidised
It's
food.
definitely one of the perks. And every time loads of MPs get turfed out of Parliament, as hundreds of MPs did in the summer just gone, they all obviously clamour afterwards for an ex-member's pass.
So you are a serious political journalist. People read you to
Apparently.
find out. People read you. You're also very funny. But people read you to find out what's really going on, whereas I'm a sketch writer. We have been hanging around this place trying to make light of it since Samuel Johnson in the 18th century. I am one of 2 Telegraph people doing that today. The other one is Madeline Grant. And this has been a great year for those of us whose main job is to write a prose cartoon. We go to events, we try and find out what's funny about it, we try and distill the day's events into one sort of amusing image and then write it up as a sketch. And this year, well, we have seen the collapse of the Conservative Party, as you said. We've seen the rise of the Labour Party. What was the first signal in 2024 that this was going to be a historically bad year for the Conservative Party?
We didn't even make it out of January, Tim, and the first warning signs were there for the Tory Party and at the time the then Tory leader and then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. His Rwanda bill was just stuck in this constant purgatory between the Commons and the Lords, just this constant ping-pong. 60 Tory MPs actually rebelled against Rwanda, saying it's not tough enough, we need a tougher version of this. And the real sort of standout distress signal in January was completely out of nowhere. Simon Clarke, a former backer of Boris Johnson, very big Boris fan. Simon Clarke was Liz Truss's housing secretary during her brief time in government, but he's sort of a very traditional low-tax conservative, hated a lot of what Sunak was doing on the economy. And one night in the Telegraph, no less, he pronounced that it was time for Rishi Sunak to go, and he was only the second Tory MP to make that call. The other, Dame Andrea Jenkins, has since joined the Reform Party. But Simon did not hold back, and here is what he had to say.
Is it time for you to go, Prime Minister?
The 4th Prime Minister facing calls to quit from colleagues. Heading to the Commons after a one-time ally called for him to be overthrown. On Tuesday night, the man on the right, Sir Simon Clarke, wrote in the Telegraph that the Prime Minister had gone from asset to anchor and needed to be replaced.
So that was Simon Clarke, the rebellious Tory MP, who, as you said, came from nowhere and, of course, has returned from whence he came. Dom, could you tell in early 2024 that the Tories were a sinking ship?
Pretty much, because Sunak had at that point been Prime Minister for just over a year. Liz Truss and Boris Johnson before him, both ending very, very badly with their times in charge. And Sunak had already tried various things. He'd set out his 5 pledges at the start of 2023, one of which, halve inflation, he managed to do. He was very, very chipper about that.
Yeah.
Reduce debt, more mixed results. There was something about NHS waiting lists, but again, the fact that I can't remember all 5 of those pledges shows what sort of lofty, ambitious targets they were. Starmer now seems to be falling into the same trap. His
team,
later.
His team seemed relentlessly optimistic.
The people around Sunak and lots of the Tory MPs I spoke to fell into 2 categories. Sort of the Panglossian optimists who were saying things like, oh, Dominic, of course we're going to win the election. The media needs to stop stirring things up. The public will never vote for Labour. Yes, our lot have had our difficulties, but they'll be even worse. And then the second, far more grounded camp of Tory MPs knew in their heart of hearts that the best they could have hoped for was a hung parliament. And especially after what turned out to be a fairly disastrous election campaign. That was never on the cards. But even at the start of this year, it did feel like the Tories were doomed because Sunak had promised to stop the boats. You had hundreds of channel crossings on goodness knows how many particular days. The economy was still fairly stagnant. Inflation had more than been halved, to Sunak's credit, but there was no sense of getting back to meaningful GDP growth. And just this constant drumbeat of Tory psychodrama, people openly lining themselves up. For example, Penny Mordaunt and Kemi Badenoch both voting against the smoking ban. Yes, it was a free vote, but they will not have shied away from the positive sort of Tory headlines that will have generated.
And I just remember it being one MP after another announcing they were stepping down from Parliament.
Well, we eventually hit a record total. We hit a record total, I think it was 75, which was the magic number. And it was just after Sunak called the election, months earlier than anyone could have expected.
Including very big names who I felt were trying to avoid the Portillo moment on election night. Like Michael Gove was one to say he was going to go.
Yeah, lots of high-profile figures and MPs who confided in me at the time that they were really gutted because they'd always thought, right, I'm going to stand aside at the next election, but they thought they had another 6 months of serving their constituents. They thought that their staff would know what they were going to do with their lives for another 6 months.
Well, let's talk about that, because probably the definitive image of the 2024 general election is the way in which Rishi Sunak announced it.
Oh gosh.
Were you in Downing Street?
I was in our room as described. I was on Burma Road.
You were on Burma Road, right?
I was in our press gallery, and that started just like any other Wednesday. We were all looking ahead to Prime Minister's questions. Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary at the time, was out on a trip. And then just completely out of the blue, there was something on the Today programme, a suggestion from Chris Mason, their political editor, that there was going to be an election. And there's some astonishment, and then Stephen Flynn asked Sunak during Prime Minister's questions at lunchtime, are you going to call an election? To which Sunak didn't provide a straight answer. So at that point, it was just bedlam. The lobby briefing after descended into a complete mess. And at that point, we were all on election watch. And we knew something big was coming, but we wondered maybe it's the very last throw of the dice for the cabinet reshuffle, or where some people were convinced it was some enormous policy platform, or that Rwanda flights were going to start that night. But yeah, by the time you got to, I think it was just before 6 p.m, you had that extraordinary moment of Sunak in a downpour of rain.
Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future, to decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
For those who couldn't see the clip, he was standing covered in rain. It was appalling. It was so embarrassing. His own team tried to spin it as, what a guy.
And the nation just thought, what a mess.
And the nation thought, what a mess. Now, this was a campaign which there were some surprises in. And one thing that really took me by surprise was the Lib Dems.
Oh, yeah.
We thought they would fade, but they came up with a quite clever, irritating, but clever way of keeping our attention.
It was basically an SW1 version of Total Wipeout in a load of marginal Tory constituencies. So you had Ed Davey on a paddleboard, you had Ed Davey at a Zumba class, you had Ed Davey on This Morning, you had Davey on Loose Women, you had Ed Davey on the catwalk, all rather tedious. But just as it was finally getting to the point where even the lobby, even my lucky colleagues who were able to go on Yellowhammer 2, which was the name of the Liberal Democrat battle bus.
Yellowhammer 2.
Even colleagues spending weeks on Yellowhammer 2, all very entertained by this, but they were starting to find it boring. But at that moment, Sir Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader, released the most affecting video, I would say, of the entire campaign, and it documented him caring for his disabled son. It documented the quite difficult life that Sir Ed has had at times.
One thing I think one's got to get over about care and being a carer is you develop amazing relationships. I had an amazing relationship with my mum, my gran, my son. Really special. As I've got older and had all these caring responsibilities, seen life through the eyes of my son, could not be more passionate and determined to sort out caring in this country.
And that took the Lib Dems from sort of the jokers of the pack to these powerful communicators who, as galling and as cliche as some of these stunts were, all of a sudden everyone was talking about Ed Davey. However, he wasn't the only opposition leader who wasn't Keir Starmer that people were soon talking about.
No. There was our friend Nigel Farage. The fascinating thing about Nigel is that when the campaign started, it took him by surprise. He wasn't ready. He expected it was going to come much later. And so he wasn't set up to run for Parliament himself. And I attended Reform's initial launch, which was at I think they now would admit, a seedy, rundown club in Dover with paint that was cracking on the walls and all this sort of stuff.
It's like working in Parliament.
It was like working in Parliament, yes. And it was a very unimpressive debut. And you could tell that Nigel was thinking about something, that he was frustrated, distracted, anxious. And then the very next week, suddenly he appeared in London and announced that he would be running for Parliament. And joining him at that event was Holly Valance, the actress from the actress from Neighbours, Charlie Mullins,
left the country after
he's
Labour
gone,
won.
has he?
Yeah.
Right, okay, he's fulfilled his pledge. And there he announced that he would indeed be running. And even that was still met with some scepticism by the lobby, because the event again was very last minute, so it wasn't very impressive. And then they said they're going to hold a rally in Clacton, and this is what it sounded and looked like.
Thank you for coming along this morning in such unbelievable numbers.
And thank you.
Always risky doing an outdoor event, but you're here. But I want to ask this of you. Coming along, enjoying the circus, agreeing with me, or disagreeing, but agreeing with me is one thing. But what we need is to reactivate a people's army. A people's army against the establishment. A people's army who want to get this country back on track. A people's army who want to be represented by people who think like they do. So let me ask you, will you commit? Will you commit to do your bit?
Yes.
Will you commit to help?
Yes.
Will you commit to go out there, deliver leaflets, put up posters, do all this? If you commit to help me in this campaign, put your hands up now.
There were hundreds of people there, possibly well over 1,000. It was a fantastic event.
I think that was when I first got the instinct, and lots of people in the lobby first got the instinct, that Farage was serious about this.
Yes.
And as I'm sure we'll come on to, Reform had some shockers with, for example, candidate selection and a whole series of rows during the campaign over horrible historic comments that various candidates had made.
Yeah.
But at that point, it almost felt like Farage's personal gravitas was so much that wouldn't matter, that he would win his seat, that Lee Anderson, who another very Marmite figure, but in having been up to Ashfield earlier this year when Lee defected, people absolutely love him there. And many of those voters were on the same journey that he'd been on, which was Labour for Conservatives to Reform.
Yeah, and this is one of the advantages of our job. You get to go to places where these people represent and meet their constituents, and you get a different feel from how you see it on TV.
Exactly, and Farage kept saying during the campaign, there's something happening out there.
Yes.
And he was correct to have identified very early on loads of people turned off by the Tories, but also not particularly attracted by Labour.
Yes.
What would you say your highlights were of those hectic 6 weeks on the campaign trail?
Well, I'm not saying it was a good thing, but I was there when Farage got hit by the milkshake.
Oh, wow.
And this was a little like, when people say, where were you when Kennedy was shot? Where were you when Farage was hit by the milkshake? Well, I was just a few yards away, and there was kind of a scream, and then he walked past me very quickly, covered in a pink liquid. And I had to do that journalist thing of trying to piece together precisely what had happened, and then later on, of course, I saw what had happened on TV and changed my account to match that. But I think next to that, because we've talked a lot about the Tories, Reform, the Lib Dem, what we've not talked about is Labour. And they ran this very low-key campaign. I saw Keir Starmer visit a pub which had no clients in it. It was just Keir talking to the landlord, and he didn't really talk to anyone. It was bizarre. And then I saw him visit a farmyard barn in a constituency outside Banbury. He should never have been in the running to win. And this was the cleanest barn I had ever been to. It was like a nativity stable that had been put up for the preschool kids. Exactly, a polished tractor and a completely wiped and swept floor. And there was something very manufactured and controlled about this campaign.
It was a very stage-managed campaign, the Labour
Spot
one.
on,
I spent a week on the battle bus following Sir Keir Starmer around, what basically amounted to a load of photo opportunities.
Yeah.
So we were all ferried from place to place, and we'd do a couple of days at a time on the battle bus, very, very well looked after by the Labour team, and indeed the final day, I was on the campaign, I was on the Tory bus again, very well looked after. You don't appreciate until you're covering one of these campaigns just the hard yards that the campaign staff will go to make you feel comfortable when you're covering it and putting so much into place for journalists. But on the Wednesday, when I had to get up at about 4:30 or 5, get myself to Paddington for, I think, 7:30ish, and my destination was Swindon, but more specifically, it was a branch of Morrison's in Swindon, 2 minutes from the station, and again, there was another very choreographed Q&A with Starmer and with the shop workers, and it was fine. It sort of passed without trace, and next thing you knew, you'd sort of spent 2 hours in the top floor of a Morrison's above the actual supermarket waiting for Starmer, and then the whole thing just went in a flash. And
then that's it. Yeah.
Then we did a huddle, and we got one question each from them, and then we're back on the battle bus, and 5-hour trip to York for question time and a housing site visit the next day. So these things go at such clinical pace.
I nearly broke my neck driving along the M25 to get to, again, Banbury, which was my battleground, just to see Rishi Sunak pat a cow. That's our job.
It's extraordinary.
That's our job.
It's
every day is Vietnam. What was election day and night like for you?
So I was running our early blog that day. So we did early and late blog shifts all throughout the general election. And I ran the early blog shift, which meant getting into Parliament for about 6, and then done by about 3 p.m. Went home, voted on my way home, napped, had some food, and then between the exit poll at 10 p.m. and midnight, I was basically just on call. And I did expect Labour to win the election. Certainly during a campaign which had seen the D-Day row and the betting row as well for the Tories, just the final nails in their electoral coffin. But I was still amazed when the exit poll flashed up and predicted more than 400 Labour MPs.
Extraordinary, yeah. And I was in Richmond in Rishi Sunak's constituency for that historic night, and I had to write up those events, get on a train, go back to London. I didn't sleep or go to a hotel, go straight to Downing Street to watch Rishi Sunak leave it, and then to be on hand for when Keir Starmer went into it. And my takeaway from election night is that the leisure centre where the Prime Minister's count was announced, I decided I'm going to have a cigarette because I'm knackered. And I occasionally give myself the treat of a cigarette, and I went outside the leisure centre to go for a puff. No one else was smoking. That's how Britain has changed.
Starmer's Britain.
14 years of Tory government. In the old days, that would have been full of candidates and campaign staff all having a drag, but it was just me. The only party that I spotted that evening having a cigarette were George Galloway's Workers' Party of Britain. Had I realised that, I might have voted for them.
Very passé. But no, I was with Rishi on the final day of the campaign, and there was a very affecting moment. It was in a rugby football club's reception centre, and a big facility in Southampton. And we'd all had in advance, this is going to be Rishi's big election eve speech. Obviously, most of the papers either splashed on that or featured that quite heavily. And Rishi just took the decision to go completely off script halfway through and spoke quite powerfully and quite movingly about what Britain had done for his family and his career and his vision for the country. And I think, had we seen a bit more of that side of Sunak during the campaign, and a bit less of a tetchy, throw everything at the wall type incumbent who had failed on a lot of what he'd wanted to do, who knows where we might have been.
Well, I'm sure we'll soon discover what America can do for Rishi Sunak and his family. And then, all of a sudden, in July 2024, we had a Labour government for the first time in 14 years, promising to fix this, that and the other, if only they could find their way out of the 50 squillion black hole they had suddenly discovered beneath Rishi Sunak's desk. Dom, did you expect things to go this badly, this quickly?
I don't think anyone did. I don't think that Labour themselves did. Labour ran a very policy-like campaign in many ways. They had that core pledge, which has really boxed them in on we're not going to raise income tax, VAT or national insurance. Some would argue they're broken national insurance. They would say they didn't raise it for, quote, working people, so goodness knows where business owners
just
go,
the
where
people
they
they work
go out
for.
to work.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But it was a very policy-like campaign. It was all basically around this message of, quote, change as well. A very powerful one-word slogan, because this was not so much a vote for the Labour Party, a landslide victory, Blair levels of adulation, as it was a vote against the Tories and to an extent against the way that the system's working. And what Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, have discovered quite quickly is how quickly things can and do go wrong. Sue Gray, Starmer's now ex-Chief of Staff, was meant to have had this 100-day plan for government and sort of a plan for the first year and all the rest of it, and she'd been working on that during the election. She didn't even make it to the 100th day. You've had Louise Haigh sacked as Transport Secretary.
Yeah.
You've had all sorts of things go wrong, whether it's winter fuel, national insurance, Lord Alley, Taylor Swift tickets.
Yeah.
The most moving and effective bit of Starmer's conference speech becoming the return of the sausages.
I call again for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages, the hostages.
Yes.
Just one car crash after another.
Yes.
And it feels like there's not the machine learning, there's not the muscle memory there, because none of these people have been in government for a very, very long time.
Yes.
And
yes.
most of these people weren't in government before, but it feels like there is just no idea at the moment how to actually get things done.
There are one or two people who stand out as being having a semblance of competence and credibility about them. I mean, Wes Streeting's had a very good start, I think.
Of course, although Streeting is already ruffling feathers with his jokes about colleagues, some of which might have been a bit ill-advised.
And his open opposition to assisted dying.
Exactly, no, that was a chance where Starmer could have taken a view on it. He decided, right, the government's going to be neutral, so I'm going to be neutral. He ended up voting for it, but still refuses to make the case for it, whereas whatever one thinks of the position that Streeting has taken, it is a principled position, and as Health Secretary, it makes sense that he should take a view on it.
Yeah.
Just it would make sense that the Prime Minister takes a view on it.
there was
So,
just
so
this-
far we are seeing Streeting doing politics a lot better than Starmer.
Yeah, there's just been this tragic confluence of events that on the one hand the government was saying we can't afford to give people winter fuel payments anymore. On the other hand, we're going to make it legal for old people to commit suicide. It felt to a lot of voters like a very negative signal was being sent to the old.
Of course, it feels like there's not concrete optimism. There's lots of milestones and missions and objectives and all the rest of it, but it feels diffuse. I think almost 6 months in now, 6 months in as of January the 5th. It's not the change that people were hoping to see just yet. But your job as a sketch writer must have been an absolute treat during these first few months.
It has been a delight, yes. And the thing is, I wanted to start by being nice, actually, because I think you should give people the benefit of the doubt, and I thought it would be harsh to just go in on you're all awful. And then I realised after a couple of weeks, they're just awful. And from a sketch writer's point of view, they lend themselves so well to caricature. I'm very jealous of Maddie Grant and her sketches, because she was the first one to figure out that Keir Starmer looks a bit like a pig. And she calls him Sir Oinky. And that's very good. And once you see it, you can't forget it. And that way the sketches just write themselves, because it's just about what Sir Oinky has snuffled his way through this week. But I was quite proud of coming up with Rachel Reeves is a Dalek. And that's because of the voice. Our manifesto, everything in that strange voice, which lends itself very well to saying, exterminate, you will not resist. So she, the Chancellor Dalek, I was quite pleased with that. And one thing about the metaphor is what people misunderstand about the Daleks is they're not robots.
They're not.
No, they're not. There's a little green organic creature inside it, which bubbles with emotions, with fear and hate. It's just inside a robotic casing, much like she is trapped by Treasury orthodoxy. And there's something about Reeves is that she's robotic, but I think she's also fearful. There's something in the eyes. There's a look of sheer terror of someone realises that to go from allegedly running the complaints desk at RBS to suddenly running a country is quite a big leap for someone to do, like a Dalek trying to get upstairs. It's possibly it's a step too far,
I have to be significantly more diplomatic in my dealings with the Labour Party than that. And there is obviously a bit of a difference in that for many Conservative MPs, of whom there were so many, I think there were 365 or so at the peak of the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson. Many of them love the Telegraph, many of them are very inclined to talk to the Telegraph. With Labour, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. There are Labour MPs who openly just won't talk to us. But again, the likes of Wes Streeting, for example, they understand the importance of working the entire media lobby. They understand that Telegraph readers will also have a vote at the next election, that they will be sympathetic to a lot of what Streeting is saying about NHS waste reform, etc., etc. So it's a mixed bag. But what does stand out about a lot of the new MPs, a lot of them quite scared of their own shadow at the moment, a lot of them not wanting to rock the boat, obviously, but if things do get substantially worse for Labour, or if things haven't got substantially better for Labour within the next year or so, that might change. We might see a bit of red on red where we used to take blue on blue for granted.
I couldn't agree with you more. The most interesting thing is going to be the emergence of a soft left opposition to the government. And who will lead that and what will be their battle points. But already we've seen some rebellions over winter fuel, even some mutterings about the private school stuff, because some backbenchers have those schools in their constituencies.
Exactly, not to mention the 100 or so rural constituencies that Labour now has, which again it feels as though, because they're not traditionally Labour seats, they've just not been baked into this is what Labour is offering the country. That does feel like a victory for ideology over pragmatism. But we shall see. I mean, in the meantime, that makes the role of the various opposition parties. We now have a multi-party system trapped in a two-party first-past-the-post system. But it makes
got Green MPs.
Exactly. We've got independent Gaza MPs as well, and we've had all sorts of interesting, shall we say, contributions.
So the question is, which leader of the opposition should we actually be following? Who is the real leader of the opposition?
That is a great question. I mean, obviously, nominally, it is Kemi Badenoch, and we will come on to Badenoch in a bit. But I would argue that since July, since the general election, just his knack for a headline and media appearances and getting everywhere and having an opinion on everything, it has felt like Nigel Farage has maybe done more to make himself prominent and to set the agenda more than Kemi Badenoch has so far.
How do you think he's done in Parliament? Does he suit it, do you think?
I think he is gradually learning. I think Farage is probably most comfortable, for example, on his sofa on his GB News show, making all these very glossy clips with the purpose of tweeting them out and sharing them on TikTok and all the rest of it. The Commons Chamber is not yet his natural habitat. I don't think anyone can say he's produced a barnstorming speech up there with the famous "Who are you" speech that he directed at the European Parliament about a decade ago now. But I think that Farage is learning. I think that all the Reform MPs are using Parliament quite effectively in other ways as well, with written questions, with grilling.
And Richard Tice is actually a surprisingly smooth parliamentary performer, I think.
You mentioned Richard Tice. You've now got a situation where Tice, who's Deputy Leader of Reform, and Zia Youssef, who's not an MP but is the Reform Chairman, they've put on about 7 points in the polls since the elections. They're now close to 20%, then 13%, 14%. And Zia and Richard are now saying Reform can win the next election, or at the very least that they can supplant the Tories. Whether that comes to fruition will all be down to Kemi Badenoch, who was selected for months after months and months of a painfully slow leadership campaign. So shall we talk about that?
Absolutely.
It felt never ending. It felt like more than a year.
So how many candidates were there in
So there were 6. There was Patel, Stride, Tugendhat, Cleverly, Jenrick, Badenoch.
Right. Why was it so long?
So the argument made Sir Bob Blackman days after the general election.
He was the chair of the Conservative
Yes,
Party.
the chair of the 1922 committee.
Thank you.
Because Graham Brady, Lord Brady, as I should say now, Lord Brady of Altrincham, one of the many Tory big beasts who stepped down ahead of the election, seeing the way the wind was blowing, knowing that Labour would probably unseat him and then Reform would take a dent out of his vote share as well. Brady, for all 14 years, was chairman of the then very influential 1922 Committee of Backbenchers, and that sets the rules for these things.
Right.
And Brady was gone. You've now got Bob Blackman, who quite a distinguished MP, lots of cross-party and certainly in the party is very well respected. But Blackman decided that it was time for a slow, drawn-out leadership contest to avoid rushing into anything.
Yeah.
And so you had...
Instead, we crawled across glass.
So you basically had a sort of weird cross between the X Factor, the Hunger Games and Yes Minister to determine who this conclave of just 121 Tory MPs would pronounce their new leader.
Priti Patel was knocked out first.
Yeah, then Mel Stride, before poor Stride could launch his campaign. And
before he could even launch his campaign.
One of the jokes going around at the time was Mel Stride's running for Conservative leader, who's she?
Yes, that's right. Seriously, on GB News, I saw them, they kept referring to they whenever they... Now, GB News is not pronoun conscious. They were doing that because the presenters weren't sure if it was Melvin or Melanie. But once those two had gone, it then sort of got down to the floor.
Yeah, you had this battle royale at Tory conference,
which is all about the merchandise.
Yeah, drowning in absolute
in tat, particularly Tom Tugendhat.
Tugendhat, rather.
Right, Tugendhat, yes, who I know doesn't like China, but I'm convinced he kept its economy going for a couple of weeks by importing cheap, crappy T-shirts and baseball caps and things. And
there's all sorts on my desk in our lobby office.
Yes.
Is a Tom Tugendhat stress ball, which helps me during my exchanges with the news desk at least once a week.
Right.
And also a Tom T keep cup.
Right. I've still got one of his extra large T-shirts. I still wear that sometimes in bed. It's a nice thought.
So while Tugendhat, with all his merch, made an eye-catching start and had streams of activists following him around at Tory conference, which we'll get onto in a minute. But before anything had even really happened in his campaign, there's a rather embarrassing moment. His team won't thank me for pointing this out, but his slogan, the first slogan of any of the campaigns, was "Together we can, unite the party, rebuild the country, defeat Labour."
TURD.
Not ideal. Not ideal, as Freudian slips go. They won't thank me for dredging that one up.
He had a pretty good campaign, I thought.
I think the wheels came off slightly at conference.
Right.
The assumption was always it's going to be either Rob Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch against each other in the final two, or one of those and one of the more, shall we say, centrist, moderate candidates.
Yes.
And it looked as though it was sort of fairly all to play for between Tom and James Cleverly.
Right.
Until Cleverly gave what a lot of people thought was a barnstorming speech at conference. There were murmurings about Rob Jenrick's no-notes speech, where he was David Cameron style in 2005, wandering around the conference stage, and that didn't really seem to cut through to people in the same way.
And then
of a sudden, Cleverly was out.
Yeah.
It was an extraordinary moment. So Tugendhat was out basically straight after conference, Cleverly topped the ballot, and then groupthink in the lobby, a very common thing we all alight on, this is what's going to happen, and we all agree on it.
Yeah.
And basically the thinking was it will be James versus Rob or Kemi. And when the results were read out, and it turned out that it was going to be Rob versus Kemi, won a massive victory for sort of the rightist element of the Tory party, the true blue Conservatives, as it were. And secondly, just a complete shock. And I was glad to watch back the footage and realise that none of the foul language from the assembled political journalists had been picked up. Just complete shock.
But this is the thing about political journalism. Sometimes the surprising thing is the most obvious thing. Because we follow everything really close up. We see things as they peak and trough and they go mad and they break down. And sometimes if you step back at the bigger picture and you think about it, well, in the long run, it started out being Jenrick versus Kemi and it ended.
Exactly.
And the front runner was always Kemi.
And that turned out to be a fairly straight fight between the two of them. Jenrick and Badenoch majored on two very, very different things. Jenrick was very policy heavy. He was like, I'll leave the ECHR, I'll cap migration to tens of thousands or lower. I'll do this, this and this. Badenoch, and a lot of people have quite liked this, but there does seem to be a time limit on it. It's all about first principles, personal responsibility, low tax, etc., etc.
Yeah.
How would you say that Kemi's doing?
Well, I, in my sketches, call Kemi Mummy. Because there's I think one of the strengths of Kemi is that she tells people perhaps what they don't want to hear. And I think in the short run, that's proving a problem, actually. But I think in the long run, there's something very appealing about this strict lady who steps in and says, now, you're all messing about. And I know I need that in my life. And I think the country needs it, and I think the Tory party delights in it. But having said that, I think often in politics, what you think someone is going to be, they turn out the opposite to that. And we all thought when she got it, well, Kemi is just going to dominate the headlines. Because she's going to be so wild and strange and a pit fighter.
Very pugnacious.
Yeah, that's what we thought. We thought we were going to be picking fights with people all the time. And instead
she's declared war on the humble sandwich.
She's declared war. She's become Miss Invisible. She's playing this long game of I am just going to quietly build my team and I'm going to build my case like this is an academic forum, this is the symposium. And then when she does finally kind of surface like a submarine, she goes for sandwiches.
Utterly bizarre.
Explain the sandwich.
Utterly bizarre. So this was an interview that she did with the Spectator.
Yeah.
Where she says, lunch breaks are for wimps, which is contentious enough. Many of us in the lobby love a long lunch. And then she starts going for sandwiches. She's like, they're not real food, they're what you have for breakfast.
Yeah.
So Nigel Farage, quick as a flash, on Twitter with a sandwich, ridiculing
and a glass
her.
of wine.
Yes, Sir Keir Starmer as well, saying this is nonsense. Keir loves a tuna sandwich or even a cheese toasty as a treat. So,
yeah, and I feel her pain because as a sketch writer, there is nothing worse than someone not realizing when you're joking. Because of course, the last thing you can say is "I was joking."
Exactly.
If you
Which is
say
what she
that,
ended up saying.
if you say that, you're conceding that what you said didn't land and that people didn't find it funny. So she has to kind of stick to her guns on sandwich hate.
No, quite. We've got an interesting email here, I believe.
Okay. This is from Nick Scott, who wrote in to say, I believe one of the problems the Conservatives have is similar to that of a new Premier League football manager. Will the team accept a new manager who introduces a fundamental change of direction? And if not, will they give it their all on the field of play? We must remember that a significant number of the 121 Conservative members of Parliament are of the One Nation persuasion, even the new members. If Kemi Badenoch wishes to move the party to the right, what will happen to party cohesion? My view is that we are now watching the political equivalent of second-tier football at best. What do you make of that, Dom?
Lots to go at there. And to continue the football analogy, the danger for Kemi Badenoch in the next couple of years, she delighted in giving a GB News interview earlier this month where she said the Tory party is more united than ever. But I think what Nick's email points out is that beneath the surface there are still these core differences on things like the European Court, on migration levels, on how hard the Tories should go in certain directions and on certain issues.
Yeah.
So there was such an incredible split when there were far more Conservative MPs than this. It becomes more acute now that there are a lot less Tory MPs. The danger for Badenoch is that she loses the dressing room at half-time in the way that Rishi Sunak did and can't motivate her players, assuming that she does last to the next general election, or that something happens and all of a sudden there is a Liz Truss or Boris Johnson style red card that she is just completely deposed.
I'm very impressed by how you've strung that football analogy out. There's one more factor that's taken place this year which we should throw in, which is, hello, I'm back, Donald Trump.
Yes, quite.
Won in November. And what's been interesting is to see Westminster actually united in pretending that they all like him. The exception being Nigel Farage, who really does like him.
Exactly. Sir David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary now, has been so disparaging about Trump as a backbench MP. Now the Foreign Secretary, and they're going for like all these fairly pleasant dinners and Zoom calls together by the sounds of it. It's extraordinary. But that leads us very nicely on to our last section, what we're looking ahead to in 2025. And a Trump presidency at the same time as a Starmer premiership. Trump will have Elon Musk by his side as one of his closest confidants. Musk hates Starmer, calling him two-tier Keir, attacking his response to pretty much everything. So diplomatically, that will be fascinating. So I think there's that. And then basically, can Badenoch pull it back? Or are we going to end up with Reform as the unofficial opposition, but the most prominent opposition? I think Trump and where the right goes in this country, and of course can Starmer weather the various storms that have already started, they're probably the things I'm looking out for this coming year. How about you?
Agreed, 100%. I think it's so interesting that, okay, so the story of everything we've discussed is Labour and the left winning, and historic landslide, and we should never downplay that. This year has seen a remarkable victory.
Massively. What Starmer's done as well, turning the party around from its Jeremy Corbyn days. However he goes down in office, he will always get a lot of historical credit for the sheer scale of that achievement.
But the strange thing is we end the year with perhaps because of that victory, Britain feeling a little bit isolated on the international stage, because Europe is moving to the right, particularly on borders. Giorgia Meloni is probably the most powerful voice in Europe. Argentina's got Javier Milei, who has balanced the budget for the first time in 123 years.
Tearing everything up via Ferrari approach.
And the leader of the free world is now Donald Trump, who returns and in a weird way looks like an elder statesman. And now everyone's trying to become good friends with
Probably
him.
not what Starmer expected.
No.
Certainly when he became Labour leader.
And I think the significant thing, I mean, one thing about Keir Starmer is he's never in the country.
Never hear Keir, I saw him
Never
the other
hear
day.
Keir. He of course went to the COP summit, and he was really the only significant leader globally who bothered to go.
Exactly. Everyone else sent their deputies, sent their foreign ministers, and the world geopolitically, like you say, is changing enormously.
Yeah.
We've not even had the time to touch on all the comings and goings with Gaza and with Ukraine and with various other conflicts and seismic world events this year, but I think 2025 will bring more of that. So we will have to wait and see. The world is changing. Can governments, because the Tories are part of this wider theme of if you were an incumbent party in 2024, you got voted out.
Yeah. We end the year with really the three parties neck and neck in the polls.
Exactly. It will be so fascinating. Watch this space.
Well, that's all from Dom and I today. Do you have any more questions about lobby life that we didn't answer? Did we miss a hilarious moment from the year? Do email us at thedailyt@telegraph.co.uk or find us on social media. Kamal and Camilla will be back tomorrow at 5 p.m. with your favourite stories.